If I had a nickel for every time there was a Native American cannibal monster whose name started with the letter W, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. One question we like to ask ourselves here at the Lodge is, could these two things be related? And we're not talking about lovers from Alabama. Sometimes we're talking about a very broad question here, like could the construction of Göbekli Tepe and the cataclysm of Meltwater Pulse 1b have connections? Could those be connected to the same event? Other times it's a bit more direct, like could the Native American cannibal monster called the Wet'suwet'en be connected to the Native American cannibal monster called the Wendigo? Probably. They share many characteristics, both involve cannibalism, and they both seem to have appeared around the 49th parallel. The Wendigo is pretty familiar to us at this point. Gaunt, rotting, smells really bad, just really fouling up the place as it stalks the frozen wilderness for prey. It's often mistaken for the Rake or the Skinwalker, but the Wendigo is its own unique thing, bound to the Algonquin-speaking peoples of eastern Canada and certain parts of the United States. Or at least, that's the general belief, that the Wendigo is special, unique to Algonquin peoples. But there could be a connection to something else, a monster from the western side of Canada called the Wet'suwet'en. And that might also reveal something about the origin of these two cannibal legends. If they're this similar, maybe they didn't develop independently, and maybe they stem from something a little bit less normal than we were expecting. But when we're talking about such culturally significant stories as this, monsters that really are deeply, deeply attached to an ethnic group and their story, we have to understand the people we're talking about. So I want to tell you a bit about the two tribal groups that we're discussing here, the Athabascan or Dene peoples, as well as the Algonquin speakers. Now, the Algonquin are a group of people that we've talked about pretty extensively, while the Athabascan aren't, at least not quite. The Athabascan prefer the term Dene, meaning the people, much like their Navajo cousins to the south. The term Athabascan was in fact applied to them by their Algonquin neighbors. Traditionally, Algonquin speakers met Athabascan or Dene speakers for the first time at Lake Athabasca, and the result of this was that white people, the first time they heard about the Dene peoples, heard them referred to by the name applied to them by the Algonquin. And because history is one of those fields where once a term becomes accepted, pretty hard to change it. For example, we've been trying to get people to stop using the term Dark Ages for decades now. They were referred to as Athabascan or Athapascan for a very long time, with the term Dene achieving supremacy in the last couple decades. But the Dene people cover a very, very large amount of territory. We're talking most of western central through western Canada up into Alaska and down the Pacific coast. So that entire swath of land from the middle of Canada west, that is all Dene-speaking tribes, as well as a few smaller groups. Additionally, you find Dene-speaking peoples along the American west coast, as well as down into the Navajo and Apache-speaking territories. The Wet'suwet'en comes to us through those northern Dene-speaking peoples. These are groups like the Nahanni, the Chipewyan, and the Dunezaa, or the Beaver, which is how we're going to be referring to them because it's a lot easier to say. Today, the Beaver live in part of Alberta as well as British Columbia, but they initially came from a little bit further to the east. A war between the Beaver and the Cree led to them being restricted to settlement north of the Peace River. Part of the reason that the Beaver lost that war was because the Algonquin-speaking Cree had already acquired guns from European settlers. We aren't precisely sure when that conflict took place, but it was sometime in the late 18th or early 19th century, and the Beaver first made contact with Europeans in 1793, so that was far later than the Cree, who had received their advantage of guns a long time before them. If we switch gears over to the Algonquin, who have a much longer history of contact with Europeans, and therefore a lot more information to go on, they're also a very interesting group, especially because Algonquin is both a language group and the name of a very small, very specific tribal group. Once upon a time, before European settlement, Algonquin-speaking peoples covered most of eastern Canada, parts of the Midwest, the Great Plains, the East Coast, and certain groups like the Cree even stretched into Alberta. As I said, the terminology here can be confusing because there's also a specific little group of Ojibwe who are called the Algonquin, and it's from them that we get the Wendigo legend. Although the Wendigo legend does in fact apply to a lot of different Algonquin speakers, What I'm saying here is that the version of the Wendigo, the most common one that you hear about, is the Algonquin version. The Ojibwe as a whole make up one of the largest remaining Native American groups with over 300,000 known active members. And these people live across the United States and Canada, primarily in the Great Lakes region and the Midwest. If you ask their elders, the oral histories they're going to give you will tell you that originally they came from further east, in the Land of the Dawn. As for where the Dawn lands are supposed to be, anthropologists believe that we're talking about the mouth of the St. Laurent River. The Ojibwe subgroup known as the Algonquin were originally encountered by French explorer Samuel de Champlain in 1603 after they had just won a battle against the Iroquois, ironically in the lead up to what was called the Beaver Wars. Between 1609 and 1701, all of the different Ojibwe peoples and their allies would fight a series of small conflicts known in whole as the Beaver Wars with the Haudenosaunee, who are also known as the Iroquois. And when Champlain encountered them, what he found was a semi-nomadic group of people who, rather than having a top-down social structure, ruled through an organization of tribal councils. So you'd have a band, and that band would have a chieftain, and then within each band there would be clan leaders. It's really not all that dissimilar from certain Celtic groups like the Scottish and the Irish, though I should emphasize that the system is not identical. But much as the Algonquin Cree would eventually have the advantage of firearms over their Dene beaver foes, this was the same situation where the Iroquois had acquired guns from the Dutch and the English to use against their French-supported Algonquin enemies. From those first skirmishes in the very, very early 1600s up until the French joined the conflict in 1609, the Algonquin were really on they did not have the advantage. They were on their back foot, they were being pushed. And the problem was, that was not really working out for the French traders. And for the English, who were backing the Iroquois, that was precisely what they wanted. So, in 1609, Samuel de Champlain, he decided, you know what, I'm gonna join up. And he brought French support to the Algonquin peoples. The French and Algonquin fought together for the first time at the Battle of Lake Champlain, and in this fight, it is alleged, though of course we're talking about colonial history and you can't always trust this, but it is said that the explorer himself killed 2 of the enemy chieftains with his own arquebus. And interestingly enough, this alliance between the French and the Ojibwe would last for a very long time. The sides here would be the same sides that you would see in the French and Indian War a century and a half later. In that first set, however, the Beaver Wars, it was the Iroquois who were victorious, and that resulted in a lot of groups of people, a lot of confederations being shattered, and a lot of other Native American groups having to move somewhere else as the Iroquois expanded their own territory. And when the Algonquin were given a chance to get revenge against the Iroquois when the French and Indian War rolled around in 1754, they took it. Unfortunately for them, as we all know, thanks to the help of a lot of American colonists, the French lost that war. Rather than choosing to continue the conflict with the English, the Algonquin signed on to the Treaty of Fort Niagara in 1764, making themselves an ally of the British Empire. As a result, when the American Revolution broke out just a decade later, the Algonquin found themselves once again battling American colonists. In what feels like a bit of irony, the French then jumped into that war on the side of the Americans, who were fighting the Algonquin, who were formerly allied with the French against the English, with whom they were now fighting against the Americans who had just allied with the French. Wasn't the 18th century fun? One other thing that the Algonquin had, that the rest of the tribes who sided with the English did not, was the protection of being north of the border with America. Because of this, they were protected from the American military campaigns of the 1790s that saw a lot of other tribes that fought with the English displaced. But then in the 1800s, they had a problem yet again with their own ally, which was that a lot of American loyalists had moved to Canada. But Canada didn't have a lot of room for all these American loyalists and said, hey, how about you settle to the west, where the Algonquin were? The Algonquin appealed to the crown, saying, hey, you agreed that this would be our land and we would fight for you, but the crown basically told them to go shove it and offered them a string of reservation territories. Despite this, the Ojibwe have remained one of the largest Native American groups, as I said, over 300,000 members. They primarily live in Quebec and Ontario, though there are smaller populations around Wisconsin and Michigan. And while many other Native American languages and cultures and traditions have over time faded, the Ojibwe ones are still very much alive and well. In fact, one of their most terrifying monsters is one of the best known in pop culture today, the Wendigo. We got that from them. This horrifying monster of the North associated with famine, hunger, and cold. And before we go nuts with the whole "you're not supposed to say the word Wendigo" thing, it's not real. It is taboo to bring up this topic frivolously as a joke, but it is not seen as such if you do it in an academic, serious context. The word itself is derived from the Ojibwe word Wendigo, with variants such as Wendago, Wenjigo, and Witiko. So that's across the general Algonquin families. Everything from Cree down to Carolina Algonquin, you're going to have different forms of this word. Ojibwe scholar Bajela H. Johnston was an authority on the topic, himself a member of the Chippewa of Nawash unceded First Nation in Ontario. Though he himself never received a PhD, choosing instead to teach at the secondary level and then go on to take an ethnologist position at the Royal Ontario Museum, he did hold several honorary doctorates. And in his 1995 book, The Mantus, The Spiritual World of the Ojibwe, he describes the Wendigo in the following manner. It is gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones, with its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets. The Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody, unclean, and suffering from suppuration of the flesh. The Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odor of decay and decomposition. And in specifically the Ojibwe, Cree, Naskapi, and Innu versions, the Wendigo is a giant many times larger than an average man. In these versions of the story, it grows in proportion to the last meal it ate, which is why it both eats and is ravenous and always hungry, but also is skinny. In the other Algonquin Wendigo legends, this giant aspect and the growing in proportion to the last meal is absent. And depending on the tale, contrary to a lot of depictions, the Wendigo does not necessarily lose cognition when it becomes the monster. As noted by the Chippewa ethnographer Lottie Chickaqua Marsden, and I do hope I pronounced that right, a Wendigo could be fully capable of human speech and intelligent thought, and even planning. This made them particularly terrifying. Robert Brighton, an anthropologist over at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, writes that all Wendigos were once human beings, transformed, usually irreversibly, into their monstrous condition. So, it does vary what precisely their monstrous condition looks like, and sometimes there are physical deformities that are more supernatural than they are related to starvation or craziness, but generally, you do have those set of factors. They were human, they did irreversibly transform into a monster, it's just sometimes the transformation is more one of mind than it is of body. One of Brighton's articles brought my attention to a 1767 encounter by Alexander Henry, a British-American explorer, with a Wendigo that he saw executed. To be clear, he's not the only white man to witness a Wendigo execution, but he is one of the first to write about it. On page 199 of Travels and Adventures in Canada and the Indian Territories, he begins his story of the man-eater. The tale starts as he's traveling through a place called Oak Bay during a famine in the winter. He's with a group of Native Americans, he lived with them for about 2 years, and he says that a young man came out of the bush looking absolutely starved, kind of wild-eyed, and smelling horrible, like beyond any sort of stench any of them could stomach. He claimed that he had had to leave his family behind because they were not strong enough to make the journey to Oak Bay with him. But his appearance, starving and reeking of a stench that foul, set off alarm bells in the natives' heads. To Henry, nothing really weird was going on here. There was a starving man approaching them, he needed food, what's the problem? But for the Native Americans, who had this legend of the Wendigo in their minds, something felt off to them. And they looked at him and they were worried that he had eaten human flesh. Obviously he denied this, but to confirm, they followed his tracks back for a whole day, eventually coming to his most recent campsite, at which point they found a fire, and in the fire, they found a roasted hand. They brought back the evidence, presented it to the young man, who eventually, of course, confessed. He told them that he had been traveling with his aunt, his uncle, and his 4 cousins. His uncle was unable to shoot anything while he was hunting and eventually became despondent, convinced that the Great Spirit had decided that, you know what, it was just time for him to die, and he didn't want to go crazy, he didn't want to kill his whole family, so it was better if they just killed him. And obviously his wife did not want to do this, but the young man and the couple's oldest son agreed that they would do it, so they butchered their uncle, his/dad, and then they proceeded to eat him. But of course that was not enough because they still had a journey to make, so they killed the younger 3 kids and also butchered them. And then for reasons that aren't elaborated upon, they just left the mother to die, which seems the cruelest thing of all here. Once they ran out of food from the younger children, however, they were left in a bit of a predicament. Now there were 2 of them, they were still hungry, and they had no food. So the young man who was remaining was the survivor of what must have been a rather exciting brawl. The remains that everybody had found at his his campsite were the remains of his cousin, the last one alive, who he had defeated and then eaten. And Henry tells us that the natives he was with believed that once somebody had eaten human flesh, it was gone. They could not be rescued, they could not be saved, they would crave it forever, they would never be safe to be around, the only thing you could do was kill them. And the man's actions really weren't helping his case. They would bring him food, and if he was starving, as he said, he should have eaten the food, he should have relished the food, but instead he picked at it. He would eat it, but he wouldn't seem happy about it. Instead, he would spend most of his time staring at the children and remarking on how fat they were. Not in a, you guys should stop feeding them so many fudge rounds way, more in a, they look tasty way. They resolved to kill the man, who Henry clarifies they referred to as a Wendigo, and what they did was, without telling him, they just snuck up behind him and buried an axe in the back of his head. But we've talked about the Wendigo a lot. I brought it up right now, mainly to give you guys an idea of what we were comparing it to. We have this gaunt, skeletal visage of a human, driven by an evil spirit to consume his brethren. Utterly irredeemable, cannot be saved, just the only solution to a Wendigo is to put an end to it. How about that counterbalance? How about the Wet'suge? The Wet'suge simply hasn't seen nearly the same level of study as the Wendigo, with most of the documentation we have on it coming from a single Canadian ethnologist named Robin Wrightington. I found an article that Wrightington wrote back in 1976, which was comparing the Wet'suge and the Wendigo, and I found it asked some really good questions. He had studied both and noted a number of similarities between the two. Both are cannibal monsters of human origin, born of the breaking of either a cultural or a personal taboo. And he began that article by introducing the concept of the Wendigo before moving towards the Wet'suge. And he had two themes common to basically every version of the Wendigo. The first is that it is defined by the desire to eat human flesh. That is what makes a Wendigo a Wendigo. And it is generally believed by the native peoples who have Wendigo legends that this is driven by an evil spirit either possessing or influencing the person. Essentially, the act of eating human flesh, even if it is in desperation, opens you up to have the Wendigo spirit come and oppress you. It's kind of something that you can look at like demonic oppression in the more Christian canon, even if it's not quite exactly the same, but you can see some of the same factors. Studying both led Robin to ask three main questions. The first was, are the Dene and Algonquin cultures so different that the same cannibal monster belief can have almost exact opposite meanings in two different contexts? 2, if it does mean something different, why? And 3, is it possible that the idea of Wendigo psychosis is more a function of our own categories of thought than that of the natives themselves? Wendigo psychosis, of course, is the more scientific term for that Wendigo influence, that Wendigo possession. A lot of times, and I've talked about it this way too, the Wendigo is talked about as being a monster in and of itself, whereas it seems to be something a little bit more in between. It's not quite a monster, nor is it just a person doing something. It is a person who is being influenced to do something by an evil spirit. Obviously, that's not something that you can put into medical terms, so you call it Wendigo psychosis, somebody who is acting in a psychotic way because of the Wendigo belief. So why would he ask these questions? To answer that, we have to understand what the Wet'suge is. And we're going to do that by looking at some of the things he learned from the Beaver peoples, who he absolutely emphasizes take this extremely seriously and do not discuss it frivolously. The Wet'suge story goes back to primeval North America, a time when giant beasts roamed the earth and long before humans had become the apex predator. Literary scholar David Gilmour described it as a time of primordial darkness when monsters dominated humans. These giant animals were called things like frog person, spider person, beaver person, and they were basically just giant versions of the animals that would eat human beings. They would hunt us down, and we had no choice but to cower in fear in our caves. But one day, a hero came along, and his name was Saya, and he ended this threat. Guided by the good spirits and using some supernatural powers, Saya was able to defeat many of these giant man-eating monsters, these Only-Nachi. But he doesn't get all of them. Some of them he's only able to chase underground, and there they remain. And that's actually, in certain versions of the story, what causes there to be mountains, places where the ground is higher up. And Saya is able to do this, so far as I understand, because one of those giant supernatural man-eating monsters granted him some supernatural powers when he was a child. For some reason or another, Saya found himself in a situation where his stepmother tricked his father into abandoning him to starve to death on an island. But as he was laying there, basically just accepting the fact that he was going to die, a voice spoke to him and it told him how to survive. It helped him. This both saved him from his ordeal and granted him certain supernatural protections. And along with the strength to fight against these monsters, he gained some other supernatural abilities like creative powers. When he killed one of those giant creatures, one of the only Nachi, he could cut up its body and throw the various pieces onto the ground and tell them what kind of animal they were going to be. But like I said, he allowed some of these animals to live, and I'm not totally sure that I understood this aspect properly, but I guess they became the bosses of the smaller versions of them. So in one instance, there's a giant moose that lives underground, and it is the alpha moose. Like I said, I think I understand, but again, the article I found here seemed like maybe it was intended for people with a little bit more base knowledge of mythology. If you'd like to read it yourself, or if you're familiar with this work, what I was using was an article by David Martinez from the University of Minnesota that was written in the Canadian Journal of Native Studies from 2006. I do not recall what the article was called at the moment. It is not written down in my notes, because I'm silly and goofy like that. In any case, by defeating the giant animals and creating the smaller ones, he has flipped the script. The humans have now gone from being the hunted to the hunters. Now here's how this factors into the Wachuge stuff. Upon reaching puberty, back in the day, all of the boys of the Beaver tribe would go on a vision quest. And this was after the example set by Saya's ordeal being left on the island. They would go out into the wilderness where they would enter a dreamlike state, and if they were successful, they would speak to one of these spirit animals, one of these medicine animals, they're called. From this medicine animal, they would receive both their supernatural power and the related taboo, and all of these things were connected to the mythology of that medicine animal. If the taboos were broken, the man risked becoming too powerful. He would be overcome by the primeval spirit within and develop those same man-eating tendencies. And as I said, there was a myth associated with every supernatural power and taboo. Each myth contains the necessary relevant information about the powers and about those taboos. And Wrightington says that adult members of the Beaver tribe are expected to know the taboos and by extension the powers of all of the people they frequently come into contact with, so that they don't accidentally trip them and make somebody become too powerful, because then that person could become Wachuge, and then the entire tribe would be at risk. For example, one man he traveled with, a Charlie Yehi, was a dreamer, one of the prophets of the Beaver tribe. They were driving one day, and he turned on the radio to a country western station, but one of the younger men they were traveling with reached over and turned off the radio and said, "Old man, he don't like that." Of course, linguistic barriers aside, what matters here is that the old man didn't just not like country music. Country music was very popular amongst this demographic, these Native Americans from Canada. But it wasn't just that Charlie, the old man, didn't like that. Country music was very popular amongst Indigenous Canadians. What it really was his taboo. Because his medicine animal was the spider, he couldn't listen to anything involving stretched string. And this is because the spider would use its web to generate a low humming sound to lure curious humans who would then get caught and have their insides sucked out. So since a guitar string is stretched like that spider silk, that's a taboo. He can't listen to guitar music. If he listens to country music, he might become too strong. Another native man from the Beaver tribe, a Jumbie, told of a story where a white woman tried to take his picture with a flash camera, and she was a white woman who knew the Indians well, according to this story. So when she tried to take a picture with a flash camera, Jumbie dove under a set of blankets so that he would not be caught by the flash. The reason it matters that the woman knew the natives well is that somebody can't knowingly break your taboo or cause you to break your taboo. Someone who's a child or an outsider, if they were to play a guitar in front of Charlie, for example, or take a flash photo of Jumbie, that wouldn't necessarily break the taboo because they don't know. Outsiders are like children. They haven't been exposed, and therefore it's not their fault. Somebody who knows about the taboos, on the other hand, if they break them, then it's a problem. As for the flash, it's because Jumbie's medicine animal was the Thunderbird. So, if somebody takes a flash photo of Jumbie, he could become too strong. But what does becoming too strong mean? What does it look like? Well, if one becomes too strong and nobody stops the transformation soon enough, you could become a Wachuge. One example of a time this happened, according to Ridington when he was talking to members of the tribe, was Charlie was at a cafe and the jukebox started playing a song with guitar in it, and he began to become too strong. What precisely that means is not recorded, but what's said is that they had to take him out of the cafe, out of town, into the wilderness, and sing his medicine song and bring his medicine bag, and that was enough to calm him down and stop the Wachuge transformation. But while we don't get a description of Charlie's Wachuge situation, Ridington starts referring to it as performing the Wachuge role, as a Wachuge performance, which I found interesting. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with it, but it was an interesting and not entirely inaccurate way of discussing it. And he does actually give us an example of one that happened and what it looked like. And this was the case of a guy named Asa. Asa was a man in his 70s who had several children with a woman in her 30s, but she eventually left him for a younger man, but he still got to see the children, still had custody of their youngest daughter, a 5-year-old girl. Now, because Asa was so old, he wasn't able to hunt for himself, and he didn't have any younger members living in his household, so anybody who had fresh meat, any of the other hunters, when they had some, they would bring him a portion. One day, there were some people staying with the community who were not members of the community, and for some reason, somebody brought him meat that had fly eggs and flies buzzing around in it. Asa, being given a gift and not asked if it was okay for him to eat, his only option was to eat it, so he did. But his medicine animal, and I will say, if I am using this terminology incorrectly, I do apologize. I am doing my best based on what I understand from it. But his medicine animal was the frog. It's not said precisely what the taboo that was violated by eating the meat was, but it seems like it was probably eating flies or fly larvae. After this, he began to jump around on his bed and shout and just generally act irrationally, and partially because of the connotation of the taboo being broken and somebody going Wachuge, to us as people from outside of the culture, this might just be something that we kind of look sideways at and say, is that guy okay? Like, does he need help? For everybody who's grown up with the Wachuge story, they look at this and they say, if we don't do something about this really quick, that guy's gonna become an immortal cannibal. The only major physical transformation is not apparent externally. What it is that they become extraordinarily difficult to kill. They become nigh immortal because their bodies, their internal organs, are now made of ice, and they have to be melted over a fire before they can be killed. Now, Asa avoided being killed because his youngest daughter was able to go and get his medicine bag and wrap him in his medicine blanket and sing his medicine song to calm him down. Now, I'm sure that all of these terms could be more specific, but I do not have the vocabulary to present them in more specific terms. But not all people who begin the Wachuge transformation are so lucky. Jumbi, for example, told the story of one Wachuge who killed a young man. They waited outside of his home and called out to him. When he walked outside, the Wachuge snapped his neck, and this caused the young man's family to seek revenge. In the story, there's an argument between a younger man and one of the middle-aged men about who's going to take the first shot at the Wachuge. The younger man takes the first shot and gets rocked. The middle-aged man then goes and wrestles the Wachuge for an hour before picking him up and, in a WWE-style move, grabbing him by the knee and the neck and snapping his back over his knee. Pretty badass, if I'm gonna be honest. But that's not enough to kill the Wachuge. It's enough to paralyze it, and it just keeps screaming about how it's going to get up and kill them all. They have to throw it in the fire to get it to finally stop. And it's said in the story that the fire burned for an entire night and all of the next day before the Wachuge finally melted enough to die. And another man, a guy named Aku, told a story about a Wachuge who lived in a house by a lake. Now, I should note that the Wachuge in the first story is said to be one that stalks and tracks and hunts and lives out in the wild away from everybody else, whereas this one lives in a well-known spot to the extent that everybody knows a cannibal lives at that lake, and they still go to the lake. Why do they still go to the lake? The lake is teeming with fish and they are hungry. Now, the Wachuge, of course, having the appearance of a man, would welcome the travelers to the lake, and he would offer them some of his fish. Hey, you guys are hungry? You want some salmon? But he would serve them the salmon on plates made out of wood, and he had carved images of monsters into the wood, and there's not a ton of, clarification given here, but it seems like, based on the information, that he was carving monsters into the wood and feeding the fish to people on the wood, and also the included detail that he's a medicine man that I forgot to introduce. But yeah, he's a medicine man who serves fish to people on plates plates that he carved runes into, and then the people die. So it sounds like he was using magic plates to kill people and eat them.
And then suddenly, the salmon on the plate suddenly turned into a man, proclaiming he was 5,000 years old.
This is not the 5,500-year-old salmon story. Do not bring Finton into this. But there was a boy who knew of this lake, and that boy and his grandmother were hungry, and they knew of the monster man by the lake, so they decided that they were going to go to the lake that had many fish. They were just going to stay at a different part of the lake with many fish, but the boy knew about the monster and he was curious, and he had a little something up his sleeve too, you see. According to the story, he was half buffalo. So the half buffalo man goes to see the cannibal man, and the cannibal man feeds him some fish, but half buffalo man, he doesn't die. Nah, half buffalo man here, he's like Thor drinking out of the horn. He's just going. He is downing fish. He is like Rasputin drinking that poison wine. Like, this guy is the Joey Chestnut of trout. But because the man was half buffalo, he could eat as much fish as he wanted. Once the Wet'suge caught on that the half buffalo man could have as much fish as he wanted, because that's just how the rules of the universe work, he demanded that the buffalo man throw up the fish that he ate so that he himself could eat it. But instead, the half-buffalo man just threw up a tiny green frog, and the Wet'suge ate the green frog. Now, I will say, in the story it is mentioned that Aku himself said he didn't know it that well, and maybe some of these details are a little garbled. Either way, I do think it's quite a funny story. I recognize that it's supposed to be taken very seriously, and in doing the research, I am fully aware of how serious this is, and I am completely respectful of that. I love these stories, I find them very fascinating, but it's just when you see how some of these stories, when you lack context, don't quite track into English as well, it is fun to look at it and just be like, all right, I need to do some digging and figure out what's meant by this, because I did take a little sidetrack. I took a couple minutes to go and try and figure out how literal this buffalo thing was, and it led me down a rabbit hole that I was simply not able to get to in this video. But we're definitely going to do some more videos on Native American mythology, because some of this stuff is very interesting. Anyway, upon eating the frog, the Wet'suge becomes catatonic. He's not feeling well, so he sits down, the boy goes back to the cabin with his grandma, and a little bit later, the Wet'suge's wife comes looking for the half-buffalo boy. And the half-buffalo boy comes back and says, yeah, I'll fix the Wet'suge, but instead he takes two sticks out of the fire that have blackened ends, and he jabs them into the Wet'suge's neck, which kills him. So, these two stories tell us some important details about the Wet'suge. They are intelligent, and they are capable of rational thought, but they're also still slaves to their cannibalistic desires. They can live either near people or deep within the wild. As I said, with the first story, this was one that lived off in the wilderness, was not close to people, was very much a hunter of men. In the second story, it's more of a social aspect. Fire is in some way deemed necessary to kill these guys. Either you have to slow roast them so that the icy organs they have melt, or you have to stab them through with charred sticks. And Wrightington suggests that the Wet'suge is, at its core, mankind returning to the role of the giant man-eating animals. So the Wet'suge is a human being who has become one of them in spirit and sort of been overcome by their influence, by their nature. So the man who becomes a Wet'suge has been overwhelmed, he's become too powerful, and as a result, he now must eat other people. And in all of this, we see some very interesting comparisons to the more eastern version of the cannibal monster, the Wendigo. Obviously, both are man-eaters, but they have some similarities beyond that. Both of them, of course, are from the north. They are synonymous with ice and winter. This is a creature of the cold. Fire is either necessary or deemed extremely effective, the most effective way of killing them. Because they are inherently intertwined with ice, fire is their natural enemy. It is either necessary or extremely effective in destroying them. The Wet'suge, as we see from these stories, must be either melted or stabbed with a charred stick. The Wendigo, on the other hand, must be either burned or decapitated, and in some versions, you have to cut out its icy heart and burn that as well, specifically. Both remain sentient and cognizant rather than being all consumed by the desire for human flesh, but the Wendigo is a little bit more erratic and unpredictable. But both are capable of human speech and can plan ahead. For example, in one story told by Lottie Marsden, the Chippewa woman I referenced earlier, she tells us of a story of a Wendigo who captured a little boy, but the boy wasn't fat enough to eat yet, so he just traveled along with the boy, and he would send the boy into town to get food and just tell him, hey, don't tell anybody you're with a Wendigo. But of course, the boy told everybody he was with a Wendigo, so they went and got the Wendigo. So that shows that the Wendigo is A, capable of recognizing that if people find out it's a Wendigo, he's going to be in trouble, and B, he's planning ahead, waiting for the kid to fatten up so he can eat him. Obviously, that's not quite the level of, I'm gonna set up my house by a lake that's teeming with fish and kill and eat the hungry travelers, but it is still planning ahead. They're also both extremely strong, the Wendigo and the Wachuge. It's not to the extent that no human being could possibly overpower them, but it is going to take a lot. You might need several people or an especially strong, heroic individual. Of course, in some legends, the Wendigo is an immensely large and strong creature that no one man is going to be able to handle alone, but we also see stories where people are called Wendigos who are really just man-sized and, in fact, even weak. There are, however, several important differences in both method and motivation. The Wendigo is pure hunter. It relies on a little bit of deception, but that's really the extent of cleverness here, is primarily an animalistic attacker. The Wachuge may go to greater lengths, as we mentioned, setting up shop on the side of a lake known for having lots of fish, so that you can eat the hungry travelers. The Wendigo might call out to you pretending it needs help, but it's not gonna set up an entire structure. A Wendigo is also pretty much exclusively going to shun society. They're going to remain out in the woods. Now, depending on how much of the story you believe, how supernatural you want to get with it, in some cases, this could be because they are animalistic and prefer the wilderness. In others, it could be because somebody is cognizant of the fact that they are a Wendigo and therefore marked for death if anybody finds out. The Wachuge, on the other hand, might socialize. This could also be the result of different cultural attitudes towards cannibalism and cannibals. The Wendigo is dangerous because it's psychotic and unpredictable and wants to eat people. The Wachuge is dangerous because it's intelligent and stable and also wants to eat people. And then there's the fact that one of these two things can be cured. A Wendigo, once they eat human flesh, that's it. They can never be cured. In some cases, there's a rare story where maybe it's kind of reversible, but for the most part, when you look at Wendigo stories, it's pretty standard. It's irreversible. You cannot be cured. You eat person, you are Wendigo. The cure for Wendigo is die. With a Wachuge, it's a bit different. Remember the story I told about Asa? The reason that he was able to be cured is because he never reached the last step of the transformation. Once your taboo is broken, you begin to get too strong. You act erratically. People are kind of given a warning that something is wrong here. You are being overcome by the spirit animal. You are being overcome by the medicine animal. What cements this, however, is the action of biting off one's own lips, chewing them, and then devouring them. Auto-cannibalism. You are now Wachuge. If somebody can get to you and sing you your medicine song first, then you're good. You can be cured, you can be calmed down, and you'll be all right. Nothing further needs to happen. For the Wendigo, while the physical changes might be gradual, the actual change from person to Wendigo is immediate. And part of this may be the function of what we're dealing with here. The Wendigo, in the most technical possible terms, refers to an ancient spirit that then possesses or influences people, causing them to eat human flesh. This makes those people, as an extension of that ancient spirit, themselves the Wendigo. A person becomes a Wachuge, on the other hand, when the medicine animal overwhelms them, when the man-eating instincts of the creature that gave them their supernatural powers as well as their taboos is unable to be contained any longer. It's not that they're being influenced to do something they otherwise wouldn't do, it's that they are no longer restraining themselves. They have become too powerful rather than succumbing to weakness. And you can see this because of what the initiating action is. For the Wendigo, what initiates the transformation is the action of eating somebody else's flesh. When you're talking about a Wachuge, it's that somebody violated a taboo. They had a restriction, they had a responsibility to keep that restriction, and they failed. The cannibalism, in the case of the Wachuge, is the final step of the transformation. And though I could go on, that's probably the most important difference between the Wachuge and the Wendigo. Or at least it's the most culturally relevant difference. A Wachuge is a person who has allowed himself to become too powerful by not practicing the restraint demanded by his taboos. In doing so, they selfishly claim power for themselves at the expense of their communities. The Wendigo, of course, is somebody who has succumbed to the weakness of their own hunger or greed at the expense of another person. But there's also some stuff in there that I wouldn't compare to the Wendigo, but rather another Dene legend. And I didn't expect to get here going into this, but considering that the Navajo and the beaver are both Dene cultures, I had to look at skinwalkers. I had to look at it. Because there's some similarities here that you can't ignore. And knowing they come from the same umbrella culture makes that even more interesting. For example, skinwalkers also break taboos to gain their powers. Both are clever, using more than simple mimicry to hunt their prey and get their kills. Both require a multi-step process that requires taking on the instincts and spirit of an animal. Both of these monsters remain perfectly sentient, though perhaps corrupted by their power, after their transformations. And both are weak to fire, and specifically weapons covered in ash. It seems that whatever magical barrier exists here with skinwalkers, Wet'suge, and Wendigo can be penetrated by fire and the ash the fire created, interestingly enough. I'm not necessarily sure that that last part applies to the Wendigo as well, but it does seem to apply to both Wet'suge and Skinwalker, although Skinwalker defines it as specifically white ash in most instances, whereas it seems anything charred is fine for the Wet'suge. And so we come back to these questions asked by Robin Wrightington. The first one, I'll remind you, was, are the Dene and Algonquin cultures so different that the same cannibal monster belief can have almost exact opposite meanings in the two different contexts? In his conclusion, he suggests that yes, there are many cultural similarities here, but that's broad. We're talking generally speaking here. You've got similar archetypes in mythology, for example, but minor details exist that could also cause key variations. I'm inclined to agree, especially considering that we don't really know how the cannibal monster legend here originated. Was there one legend universal to the early American peoples that eventually split into two? Did two separate cannibal monster traditions evolve amongst two completely different peoples independently? Or did it start with the Dene and transfer over to the Algonquin through cultural osmosis? Or, of course, it could be vice versa. I'm not trying to suggest that it was one direction or the other. And something as simple as one culture seeing cannibalism as evil, whereas the other culture sees cannibalism as psychotic, could lead to completely different legends later on. And this leads us into question 2. If these cannibal monster traditions mean something different to these two cultures, why? Wrightington suggests that it could be that the legend originated as one that then split in two, and we're just looking at divergent evolution here, or it could be that there were two groups of people with the same cannibal monster legend. One of those groups of people experienced some sort of event that changed them at a cultural level, and in that sense, it affected the cannibal monster legend, and that's why you have the changes. Basically, a rapid shift in lifestyle could have led one group's cannibal monster to develop new or different characteristics. Wrightington suggests that it could just be divergent evolution. Originally, there was one cannibal monster legend, and then as groups separated and as there was a diaspora, it changed as they encountered new environments, new different people, and new specific problems. It also could have been a rapid shift in environment or lifestyle that only affected one group of people who had the same cannibal legend, thus changing their cannibal legend without changing the overarching one. If the two legends do derive from one, as Wrightington is suggesting here, I find divergent evolution to be the more likely option here. The Wet'suge and Wendigo on their own have already a good number of differences, but then when you look at how those legends differ on a tribe-to-tribe level within the general language families, you see even more variation. That would suggest that the split between Wet'suge and Wendigo from whatever that archetypal monster was happened a very, 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 very long time ago. Long enough ago that the two that diverged from the archetype have now become archetypes of their own. But based on the number and the nature of the differences, it feels much more to me like this was a very long period of time over which these changes developed, not a single major event that changed the Algonquin version into what it became, or the Wet'suge, the beaver version, into what it became. And then we get to the third question. Is it possible that the idea of Wendigo psychosis is more a function of our own categories of thought than of the natives themselves? Now, this is not entirely related to the Wet'suge, but it is in the sense that the Algonquins see this as psychotic, and the beaver, the Dene in general, don't. Yes, eating human flesh is extremely antisocial, but it's that it's wrong. It's that it's evil. It's not that it's crazy. For the Algonquin, it's so unfathomable that somebody could eat human flesh that you have to be insane. The Wendigo isn't necessarily evil, it's insane or it's possessed. And we of European descent typically view things in two ways when it comes to the paranormal. We view either monster or demonic possession / influence, and this seems to be something a little bit more in the middle. We like to see either a non-human monster or there's a spirit of some kind pulling the puppet strings. In this case, these are both monster and man, both paranormal and natural. And in that sense, the Wet'suge and the Wendigo are both very, very real. These are both monster and man, both paranormal and natural. And in that sense, one can make the argument that both the Wet'suge and the Wendigo are very real. While I let you digest that, if you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can subscribe on Patreon for just $1 a month, though there are higher tiers if you feel like being more generous. You can also subscribe as a channel member here on YouTube, which grants you an ad-free experience and gets you access to things like Drunk Folklore, just as Patreon does, for $5 a month, or there are higher tiers. You can use those if you like. And if you're catching this video as a premiere, guess what? Tonight there's a brand new Drunk Folklore coming out on Patreon. If you're not catching this video as a premiere, guess what? The day this premiered, there was a new Drunk Folklore. Go watch it. If you'd like to rep the Lore Lodge and tell the world how much you love Wendussy, you can check us out at thelorelodge.shop. You can also buy our coffee from Tableau Roasting Co. via the link in the description. Mount Pocono perk is how we stay awake here at the Lore Lodge.
We could use a bit more at the moment.
If you want to watch the shenanigans as we explain these concepts to you live, you can do that 7 p.m. Sunday every week, unless we decide it's going to be Monday for some reason, like the Eagles had a game. And if you like watching a man with coiffed hair explain history or the Bible to you, you can do that as well on our channels The History Hut and The Weird Bible. And both of those channels now have their own podcast, one co-hosted by Stakuyi and the other co-hosted by Wendigoon. And of course, the best way to get updates about what we're doing here at the Lodge is our Discord server, and you can get to that by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge. Also check me out on Twitch. It's twitch.tv/theaidenmattis. We play some video games, we have some chats, it's fun. With all that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.